So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first panel. It is a great pleasure to moderate a discussion with such distinguished speakers, whom I would like to briefly introduce to you. First, on my right, we have with us Marta Gina. Marta is a partner at the well-recognized global law firm Norton Rose Fulbright. She studied law in Essex, Paris, and Valencia, and I'm sure that we will benefit from her extensive practical experience in the area of antitrust and competition law. Then on my left, we have on board Professor Ulrich Schwalbe. Ulrich holds the chair for microeconomics and industrial organization at the University of Hohenheim, Stuttgart in Germany. In his research, I think he puts a particular focus on competition and game theory, but at the same time, he keeps very strong connections with various practitioners. And last but not least, again on my right, we have on our panel Emilio Calvano. Emilio is associate professor at the Department of Economics of the University of Bologna, and he's also affiliated with the Toulouse School of Economics. And he describes himself as a micro theorist whose job it is to write mathematical models that make sense of the world. So welcome to the panelists, and thanks for joining. So our panel, as you see in the program, is going to focus on pricing algorithms. And Isabel de Silva already explained when thinking about the risk of collusion that we can distinguish between different scenarios. And this is the topic of our panel. And given the introduction that we already heard from the two presidents, without further ado, I would like to start with a statement by Emilio. And Emilio recently published a paper titled Algorithmic Pricing, What Implications for Competition Policy? And he has at least two further papers in the pipeline, also dealing with algorithmic pricing. And in particular, he has chosen an experimental approach. He has done experimental studies on the behavior of pricing algorithms that involve so-called Q-learning, which is a common form of so-called reinforcement learning methods. And Emilio, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the algorithms that you used and about the experimental approach in general, and also about the findings that you made in your work.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Thank you very much, Isabel and Andreas, for organizing this fantastic conference, which is an opportunity to talk about something that I believe is deeply interesting. For a very simple reason, because we're increasingly delegating these key managerial tasks to these algorithms, and these algorithms at the end of the day, as Isabel was pointing, they shape our consumption choices. So it's important that we understand how they work and what they're doing to our marketplaces. Now, today, the goal of the next 8 to 10 minutes is to talk to you about the latest vintage of these algorithms, which is powered by AI. So I will talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and then sort of dive into an experiment that we conducted at the University of Bologna about collusion. Okay, so the possibility that these algorithms might autonomously learn to charge super-competitive prices in a collusive sense. Now, so what is AI? Okay, that's a complicated question to answer, but at least to me, AI is basically a set of tools. Oh, yes, I don't need the slide now. So wait, yes, it's late. So I just have one slide. Sorry, as an academic, I could, I just couldn't do it without. So I just, so what is AI? So complicated question. To me, that basically means that it's a set of tools and techniques that are meant to crack what economists call dynamic decision problems, okay? So the conceptual framework is extremely simple. So you think about a decision maker, okay, who has to make a sequence of choices. Now, before making any of those choices, the decision maker is going to observe something about the environment that surrounds him, which is relevant for the choice at hand. And then after making its choice, is going to observe a measure of how good that choice was, say a reward, and how the environment around him changed as a consequence of that choice. Now, AI has been applied. So this sort of framework is very powerful and has been applied in a variety of contexts. As you might have heard in the news, the most astonishing results have been reached in the context, say, of AlphaZero beating the world champion of chess, right? There, the context being the chessboard, the moves being what is the next piece, and then the reward being whether I win or lose the game, or Uber using AI to teach self-driving to teach cars how to drive themselves, and so on. Now, basically, AI, in a nutshell, is about making choices and predicting the consequences of those choices moving forward. So it's basically a problem of prediction, and in order to predict what's going to happen, you need data. Now, this data could come from outside sources. We record, data on some marketplace and we feed it to the algo, or this latest vintage is actually generating its own data. So AlphaZero learns how to play chess by playing against itself. The zero stands for zero data. They're not feeding in any data about professional chess playing. It literally teaches itself. Okay. Now, so what is new? We've been using, as Isabel was saying, algorithms since the 80s in the airline industry and in the hotelier industry and so on and so forth. But this vintage is particularly interesting because it's basically model-free. Okay, so you don't need to inject a structural model of the industry to make it work. So what the programmer does with these algos is just specifies an objective function, maximize profits / win the game, which context to monitor, look at demand, look at what my competitors are doing, and which actions it can take. Okay. Now, given these just three very simple and natural ingredients, it's gonna figure out how to crack the problem. And so what typically CS guys are interested in is, does it crack the problem? Is it efficient? How much time did it take to crack the problem? And what did it learn? How? Okay, because sometimes these tools taught us ways to resolve problems that were not known to humans as well. Okay, now it's not just a question of AI doing things better, like doing the same task in a more cost-effective way. This is certainly important, but it's also a matter of AI doing things differently. Okay, and so we have to understand, if that happens, how different those things are. Do the theories that we have or the practices that we developed give us a good handle in a world in which these tasks are performed by agents which are doing the same thing in a different way? So that would be sort of the broader research program. And then let me try to dive into the experiment in the last 5 minutes or so. Okay. So what we've been doing, we've been thinking about applying these tools to a price setting problem. So the idea being, think about two independent AI-powered pricing agents setting prices on some marketplace. You could think of Amazon.com, eBay, Booking.com, but there are also offline applications. Supermarkets, Shell is using these tools in Denmark to price gas, and so on. Now, in this context, the idea is the agents are going to independently choose prices over time. They're going to monitor each other and demand conditions, and they're going to, as these tools work, adapt their pricing rules in a way to maximize profits. That's their objective, the long-run profits. Of course, I mean, the obvious question here is, so what is going to happen? Is this going to lead to higher prices or lower prices? Okay. And that's what basically the experiment is all about. Now, let me take one step back and tell you why we're doing experiments. Now, in principle, you could, if you know the algorithms, in principle, you could ask yourself the question, what would be, in theory, what would be the outcome of this interaction? Okay. That amounts to what mathematicians call solving stochastic dynamic system of difference equations. Okay, that's a very highly complex task and a dead end. So right now, with the degree of sophistication that these algos have, it's virtually impossible to study them in theory. Now, what we collectively learned in the past 30 years or so, it's also that it's very hard to detect, for instance, collusive outcomes by just looking at data. right, on marketplaces, okay? Because it's very hard to tell collusion apart from other kind of lawful behavior. So you're basically left, if you want to inform this policy debate, with doing experiments. So that's exactly what we do. We code up these algorithms from scratch. We test them in a synthetic marketplaces, which is fully controlled by us. And then we let them interact for as long as needed for them to figure out how to solve the problem, so to speak. And then we look at what they learn at the end of this exercise, okay? Now, of course, we're well aware that this exercise has two big external validity issues, as we call it in economics. So one issue is how realistic are these algorithms that you guys are testing relative to those that we might expect being used in real marketplaces. The second obvious issue is how realistic is the simulation of the marketplace that you're using relative to what's going on in real marketplaces. Now, with respect to the first concern, I know Ulrich is going to talk more about external validity. We take a step back and we say, we're not using anything sophisticated. We're actually testing whether textbook algorithms can actually learn to charge supra-competitive prices. So we're literally looking at how chapter 7 of the reference textbook in reinforcement learning performs in this particular context. And the idea is that if even extremely simple algos are able to solve this problem, then we might expect that to be a problem also for more sophisticated vintages of those algorithms. In the second respect, we apply them to a very rich oligopoly model, which is a workhorse model in industrial organizations. That is a model that IO economists have been using for many years now, so it's well understood, to recover structural parameters from those markets, okay? So that is how we tackle that problem. Again, at the end of this interaction, do they charge high prices? And if so, two hypotheses. The first hypothesis would be they charge high prices because they fail to learn how to effectively compete. In a sense, because algos are dumb. They're dumber than humans, if you want. The alternative hypothesis is that they charge high prices because they actually learn to support those high prices through those reward punishment schemes that we call collusion in the profession. Now, the only slide that I had was meant to show you, to depict you the strategies, so what they learn at the end of this training phase. So what you're looking at, these are prices which are charged by the algorithms after a long interaction. Now, I already told you that they end up charging high prices, which in this context means prices above the Bertrand-Nash competitive benchmark, which should be a dotted line on the back, on the bottom of the graph. Okay. Now, the exercise here to show you how they support those prices is the following. We let them interact, and then the experimenter intervenes, overrides one of the two algorithms' choices, and charges a much lower prices. After that, we observe what happens. Now, what happens in this particular experiment, and of course this is sort of very robust, is that agent 2, if I remember correctly, which didn't cut his price, in the period after observing his rival cutting his price, he cuts significantly the price. Now, more interestingly, agent 1, in the period after he himself cut his price, goes down and further cuts his price. Now, this kind of self-reactive behavior would be hard to reconcile with other explanations of this figure. In a sense, the idea is agent 1 didn't observe agent 2 lowering its price. So if its objective was to maximize profits, the only rationalizable reaction would be to go back up. The only reason why agent 1 would further cut his price is because he's expecting, in a sense, agent 2 to cut his price. And then what follows after that is what we interpret as a punishment phase. So with finite duration, so with prices slowly recovering. Okay, so that's the archetypical strategy that they learn in our simulation, and I can tell you that this is collusion in the economic sense, that those high prices are supported because the long run loss due to that price war that you have in front of you exceeds the short-term gain of undercutting those prices. I just have 3 points, short points, and then I'll conclude. So first of all, let me try to exploit this crowd to control a little bit the message of this paper. So we're not saying that algorithms are bad. Actually, I do think that algorithms are a great development in marketplaces because they allow to they allow to charge better, quote-unquote, prices, and that increases allocative efficiency. The message of this paper is that we cannot work under the assumption that things cannot go wrong. Okay? So what we show in this paper is that there is this possibility, and then we leave it to future research to understand how real the risk is that in actual marketplaces, malfunctionings like this might happen. Okay, so let me tell you that this second point was meant with skepticism at the beginning. I remember when we started, the CS guys told us this is an impossible exercise to perform, and the economists told us, okay, this is never going to hold up in reasonably complex and rich environments. And in a sense, one thing that we did was to move the ball forward. Now the question is not whether this is possible or not, but the question is whether this is real or not. Okay, and this is something that we should figure out in a sense collectively. The last point is that this methodology, the one that we use, which is testing algos in synthetic environment, is something that authorities could, and in my opinion, should do without problems, because you can always subpoena those algos, and you can always have a team that actually performs this kind of experiment to make sure that the risk of malfunctionings, so to speak, of various sorts is not that high. Okay, thank you very much.
So thanks also from my side for this very valuable insights, and I think they are very helpful, especially to set the stage for our discussion. And you already posed the question of how realistic is the simulation and how realistic are your assumptions, and put this also in your one of your final remarks. And I think this nicely connects to the work Ulrich has done. Ulrich has recently published a paper matching today's topic too, titled Algorithms, Machine Learning and Collusion. And in this paper he also considers views from the legal literature and insights made in the areas of computer science and economics. So Ulrich, could you tell us what is your take on the concerns that the use of smart self-learning algorithms could facilitate collusion, and what does economic theory tell us about this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sebastian. Well, to assess whether there are novel or additional competitive concerns about collusion by learning price-setting algorithms, I think several questions have to be answered. The first one is, can algorithms in principle learn to collude? And as we have seen, this question has been answered in the affirmative. Simulation results have shown that rather simple learning algorithms can indeed learn to behave in a collusive way. But, and this is the second question, can the results of the simulations be transferred to real-world markets? And I think to address this question, it seems advisable to consider some of the assumptions made in these simulation models and compare them to real-world markets, also to give some hints in which ways these simulations could be extended. And let me begin with one central assumption in these simulations, and that is firms are one-product firms and they set only one price. But if you look at e-commerce, online retailers, all these firms are multi-product firms with hundreds, even thousands of different products. Some of these products being substitutes, others being complements. And of course, profit-maximizing algorithms have to take into account these relationships between the different goods. So the question is, can could algorithmic collusion also emerge in such a multi-product, multi-price framework, in particular also if firms differ, for example, in their product range? So that would be a possible extension. Look at several good firms, not just as one firm. And with multi-product firms, another problem might arise because these firms could use different pricing tactics. They could use, for example, mixed or pure bundling strategies. And that leads me to the next assumption in this model, and that is all the firms set a uniform price. So everybody has to pay exactly the same price. But that is in contrast to another concern associated with algorithmic pricing, namely that due to the fact that firms control a huge amount of data about their customers, algorithms will use personalized pricing or group pricing with very granular groups. And if I can extract all the consumer surplus already with personalized pricing, the incentive to collude is, of course, not so strong anymore. So there seems to be a tension between personalized pricing on the one hand and collusion on the others. Of course, the question arises, could algorithms actually coordinate on personalized pricing or group pricing? But that makes it necessary that the algorithms would have to have much more information. Not only the prices have to be observed, but also to whom has that product been sold at this very price. Let's turn to the next implicit assumption, that is, all firms are assumed to use the same algorithm or at least the same type of algorithm. But there are many different forms of reinforcement learning. Q-learning is a quite common one, but there is optimal adaptive learning, there are deep neural networks, and it's by no means clear that the firms independently choose the same type of machine learning. Actually, that could be considered as a strategic move in a game, which algorithm should I use, and it's not clear whether the Nash equilibrium, if there is one, would lead to a coordination on a single type of algorithm. So it might happen, and it's highly probable, that firms end up with different algorithms, and it's not clear what the outcome is when the algorithms interact with each other. One other aspect is that algorithms are trained all in the same environment. So we have the same simulated market scenarios where the algorithms are trained. But firms, in particular, if they produce differentiated products, they might have different perceptions of the market. There might be other views of what the competitors are and how the competitors may react. So it might not be clear what is going to happen if algorithms, having been trained in different simulated environments, happen to interact with each other. Just to illustrate that, imagine two autonomous driving cars having been trained, exactly the same algorithm, have been trained to drive on their own, but one has been trained in Britain, driving on the left side, and the other in France. That rather leads to collision and not to collusion. So another aspect is that algorithms remain unchanged over time. There are no changes, no improvements, no updates, no better algorithms that are introduced. And assume that algorithms could coordinate. They have charged high prices, products are sold in lower quantity. What would happen? Well, inventories would build up. And what would happen if these products would be perishable commodities? Then, of course, if the inventory is full, the manager would say, okay, what the heck, I'm going to sell at a low price to clear the inventory. Also in retailing, when significant profits would be reaped by collusive behavior, the barriers to entry in that sector are very low. So I would expect that if there's collusion, that there would be significant market entry, systematic market entry, and we would have more and more players in that market. And when the number of participants increases, then the collusion would become more and more difficult. Another aspect which does not relate to the simulation models is that we don't know very much about the algorithms that are used in practice. We know that large online platforms like Amazon, for example, they use their own proprietary algorithms. But if you look at the firms that offer algorithmic consulting, there are virtually hundreds of these firms. That's known as revenue management, yield management, repricing, or price optimizing. And that industry has emerged very quickly in the last few years. And the range of different methods and algorithms that they supply is rather wide. They start with simple adaptive rules, then there are modular systems where the firm can decide, I want to integrate my stock, the sales price, the time of the day of the week, and other factors, and can give the weights with which these factors enter into the pricing decision. So at the end, there are complex forms of machine learning that these firms offer. So they compete not only with the price of their product, but also with the type of product they offer. Some firms, they advertise that they guarantee that the firm buying that product will end up in Amazon's buy box, which is a high incentive for firms that are doing online retailing. So when we look at this type of industry, then we know that there is a large variety of different algorithms, and it's not clear what the outcome might be if different firms have chosen different algorithms. If there's just one firm that uses a very simple adaptive rule, undercut the market price by 2% unless it is below your marginal cost, that would destroy all collusion. The coordination would have to take place rather with coordination on the type of algorithms that firms use and not on the prices. So coordination would be on a higher level. We don't coordinate on the prices, but we coordinate on which type of algorithms to use and which environment we should use to train these algorithms. Therefore, I think it would be a good idea to know more about these price optimizing, repricing, revenue management firms. And I think a sector inquiry would be advisable to figure out how many firms there are at all. What types of algorithms do they offer? Is there any specialization? Do they concentrate on certain markets or industries? Automobile, pharmaceutical. So we don't have much information about this type of industry, and it would be worthwhile to learn more about them. And then the final point, and then I'm done, is what do we compare the outcome of algorithmic collusion with? Usually, as we have seen here, it was a perfectly competitive price. That is the Bertrand-Nash solution in a one-shot game. The problem, however, is that the correct benchmark if we want to know that algorithms increase or make coordination problems more severe and collusion more likely? So I think the right benchmark would be what would happen if we would, as a counterfactual, not algorithms, but humans. So I think it would be a good idea to replace the algorithms with humans and let them play in the very same framework that game. Of course, that's not straightforward. You can't lock those guys up for a couple of months and tell them play that 1 million times and then we will see what the outcome is. But I think it would be a good idea to let them play a little longer than the usual 25 to 50 times, as recent research has shown that if people interact 500 or 1,000 times, which is still realistic, then collusion might emerge later on in the 100s or 200s period. So what I think I've learned from experimental economics is that in the framework, considered in the simulations, collusion with humans would emerge more quickly, would probably be more efficient and also more stable than the collusion we get with algorithms. So if that were the case, which has to be shown, of course, then we would say it would be great if we would have algorithms, because if humans would interact, then collusion would be more likely and even more effective. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ulrich, for sharing these great thoughts. Apparently you hold a rather skeptical view on the questions that you posed, whether results can be transferred to real-world markets. And Emilio will have the chance to respond to that later. But I think we should also hear the legal perspective before opening the discussion. So, Marta, could you give us some insights as to the potential legal challenges when we face companies using algorithms, maybe also in other scenarios than the situations with self-learning algorithms? And do you think that companies should indeed use, that use pricing algorithms should indeed take concrete precautions?
Absolutely, and I think the first issue that companies are facing, and this goes to a point that was raised by Mrs. President earlier on, is awareness. And I have to say, the conversations I have had with several clients, they told me, I'd love to have questions relating to algorithms, but my company doesn't use them. And for example, this comment came from a client working in the logistics and distribution area, so I'm quite sure that his company is using some form of algorithm. So I would say that the first precaution that companies have to take, and in particular the legal service in the company, because that's the people I am talking to, is to raise awareness, to be curious, to ask questions, to talk to the IT people and to the people in charge of the algorithms. And not only because you have to take precautions and set some form of compliance, because that's where things are happening today. That's where the business is happening, and that's the real deal. And that's the best way for you as legal people to understand what your company is doing and what the future is going to be in the company. So it's really something you cannot go around. So in most cases, I would say that questions are going to be quite straightforward, and that's the good news. In some cases, and I will go back to your question earlier, but I wanted to introduce first this element. In some cases, algorithms are even going to help to reduce the risk of collusion. And I think algorithms can be very useful, for example, for intelligent adaptation to the market, what we call parallel behavior, which is not an infringement under competition law. I'm thinking, for example, about petrol stations, but also other markets in which prices are public. And it would be very easy to take advantage of those public prices to react in real time and just in an intelligent way, and therefore almost reducing the need for collusion as such. So that would be a way in which algorithms could be used in a positive way. Of course, you also have on the other side of the spectrum algorithms supporting explicit collusion, and I would say that's also a pretty straightforward question on the other way around. But there are also questions in that respect that may be more difficult to deal with. Of course, one can think about a group of companies setting an algorithm which allows to set a colluding price. I'm thinking, and this is purely a theoretical example, I have to say, banks trying to collude on credit rates. It would be very easy to do that through algorithms. So, of course, no questions. I mean, the questions raised by that kind of situations are very easy to respond because the analysis is quite straightforward. But I'm also thinking, for example, and that's something that can be done, and it's being done today, about algorithms that allow to check how products are placed in shelves, and if your products are occupying a certain percentage of the shelves in the distributor shop. And if, for example, you are giving rebates linked to the shelf space that your products are occupying and you are in a dominant position, Of course, the problem is not the algorithm. The problem is going to be the rebate. But then the algorithm makes the rebate so deadly effective that, of course, in terms of compliance, you have to be very careful about how you're going to draft that rebate, even more than usually. I'm also thinking about scenarios like RPM, and that's particularly in France, in which the legal test for RPM is very strict. So if you have recommended prices and you have an algorithm allowing you to check whether those prices are respected, I would say that the slightest form of message given to the distributors would be a problem. So that really raises the bar in terms of internal compliance and in terms of training that you have to give to your teams. Questions that have been asked by clients, and those are real questions, are, for example, more in the area of cooperation in creating algorithms. We have had, for example, clients, competitors, who wanted to create a blockchain for different purposes. And for that, of course, you have to create an algorithm, what is called the consensus algorithm, which allows to, you correct me if I'm wrong, but allows to verify that the different blocks of the blockchains are correctly connected and everybody has given the consensus that is the basis for the blockchain. So in those cases, I would say that also the question is quite straightforward. And the first question would be careful with what kind of information you are sharing when you are putting in place that project. But then you have less straightforward questions such as standardization. For example, if that blockchain comes becomes in the end the standard of the market and something that is completely unavoidable and that everybody needs to use, then you may have other abuse of dominant position questions that you have to be careful about. So going to dynamic pricing and self-learning algorithms, I would say that the first precaution that companies have to take is, again, awareness, but at a higher level. The use of such algorithms cannot go without the intervention of the legal director or the competition director. You have to be a key actor in the implementation and use of those algorithms within the company. And I know this sounds quite obvious, of course, that's going to be validated by the legal service, but experience shows that that is not always the case, and that having that conversation is not always easy, because legal service and the IT people are not talking the same language, and it's very difficult to find a common ground of understanding and really be brave and say, I don't understand, can you explain to me how this works and what are the consequences going to be on the market? So really talking to the right people in the company, I think, is really the first precaution that needs to be taken. But then I would like to raise an issue because, well, I think algorithms, when they are used in an anti-competitive way, are going to make generally authorities' life easier, because when you have an algorithm supporting some kind of colluding scheme, I would find it very difficult, for example, to avoid a by-object qualification. Very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult. So generally, I think that in terms of enforcement, that's going to be a facility provided to the authorities. But I was thinking specifically about one concept that has been very widely used these last years by authorities, which is the rogue employee concept. So I was thinking if it would be possible to develop a theory of the rogue algorithm. And it's true that when you hear the names of some of these algorithms, they have some pirate taste to them, like the knife or the Boston Shuffle. They really sound quite, you can almost imagine them filibustering across the networks. So in those cases, how far can a company go? And really, as you were pointing out, there can be some malfunctioning with algorithms. And I'm thinking, for example, about the flash crash in 2010, in which trading markets dropped dramatically for almost half an hour, I think. And well, when you think about it, you had, if I understand it correctly, you had algorithms which were programmed to buy and sell at a proportional value of the prices that were offered in the market. And they were programmed to keep on doing that even aggressively until somebody said stop. So when you think about it, you think, well, what could possibly go wrong, of course? But you know, you could have seen the risk coming in that kind of scheme. But I think that in other cases, it must be more difficult. And a rogue employee, as unpredictable they may be, have motivations. And those motivations are more or less the same all the time. It's the gain, the benefit, the gain of market shares. the motivations of an algorithm which goes rogue are much more difficult to predict for a company. So I'm really leaving this question mark: to which extent a company can be held responsible for the actions, if that can be said that way, of an algorithm which goes wild on the market, insofar as it could not be easily predicted. I think I'll stop here because I have probably gone beyond my time, but I'll just close with an ending remark. One question that has been discussed in different fora is whether we need to change competition law to adapt to these new algorithms. My personal view is that we don't. I think we have already, how to say this, stretched the concept of collusion enough in the last years in case law, with things like concerted practices, tacit collusion, etc. So I think we don't need to go further to catch the possible anti-competitive behavior linked to algorithms. And in the end, which is quite reassuring, probably we will go back to the old legal principles that we all know. And in the end, a good and well-built legal principle allows to catch most of what happens in reality. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marta, for your thoughts. I think especially the idea that we could draw a potential parallel between employees' actions and algorithms' behavior is very interesting. But as far as I see it, there is not yet a case where this was decisive. Otherwise, of course, it seems very sensible to say that companies who use pricing algorithms or algorithms of other types should think about how they could ensure antitrust compliance and what their algorithms do. But I would like to give the other panelists the chance to react on each other's statements. So Emilio, would you like to start?
Yes, so thank you for your thoughtful comments. So let me start first by addressing this last point, which I think it's very interesting. I'm not a legal expert, but my opinion is that indeed we have a problem with our liability standards. For instance, in the application that I showed you, the idea is if I tell a machine to maximize my revenues and then the machine ends up doing something wrong, like coordinating prices with a rival, would I be considered liable? I think under the current competition law, unless changes occur, it would get away with it. And so, we should think more about if we need a new legal doctrine in place. So I like this rogue employee analogy, and I think we should at least think about that. About the how to use these simulations to understand what's happening in the real world, I have two comments. First of all, I mostly agree with what Rick was saying. So I think we are on the same page in the sense that we still have to understand how big that risk is by having, say, richer and more sophisticated and perhaps tailored models, simulations, so to speak, or experiments. I like very much the idea of having a sector inquiry. So I've been looking into the repricing industry, and it's a black box. We don't understand what these guys are doing, but what we do understand is that many wholesalers and retailers are delegating their pricing to these companies. And so it's important to understand what's going on there. Let me tell you that I know for sure, going forward, do we think about AI as being a solution that will be deployed at full scale in these markets? So last week on Thursday, I was talking to a senior official at the R&D department of a massive software company, okay? And they are prototyping these pricing tools powered by AI. So I'm not sure if that prototype is going to hit the market anytime soon, but I'm definitely sure that they're doing it. And the class of algorithms that we in the academic community have been studying is the one that they have in mind when they're thinking about applying these tools. And then the last remark is about this humans versus machines idea. We should definitely do that. But then it's, again, it's a very subtle issue. What is the right benchmark for machines? So let me explain by analogy with the AlphaZero example. So AlphaZero is this algorithm that, plays with itself for 21 days and then it learns how to beat the world champion of chess. Now, in those 21 days, it's true that the algo is playing billions and billions of games. And so it's true, I guess, that if you take professional chess players, you lock them into a room and you let them play billions and billions of games, then maybe they will end up beating the algo. But that's not the kind of comparison we should be making. The idea is that these algorithms are trained offline. Training, in our case, takes 90 seconds. Okay, you can simulate years of marketplace interaction in 90 seconds. And then you deploy them online. Okay, so that changes standard. Okay, and the question is, how would these professional now price setters would perform against marketing officials at top at retail companies? Okay, and we do not know the answer to that question. I do not know how to answer that question, but we should definitely think about answering that question.
Ulrich, any last thoughts or comments from your any last words? No, not that. From your side.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you don't get me wrong. I don't think that algorithms do not cause any problems. What I think is that currently autonomous collusion by algorithms is not a major competitive concern, but there are others. The first one is that algorithms change structural market conditions. That is, they increase tremendously the market transparency, and they have a very high speed of reacting, and that makes it possible. You mentioned that they could use to observe whether everybody conforms to the resale price maintenance rule. So that would be one aspect. And the other, which is, in my view, the most important, is that algorithms are a new and very efficient facilitating device that can be employed by humans to facilitate collusive behavior, enable and stabilize collusive behavior. But it's not autonomous collusion by algorithms, but it's collusion by humans using algorithms. I think that is why we should closely monitor this spot. There are a lot of things going on currently. You mentioned SAP with their price-setting software. Shouldn't
I didn't mention.
No, you mentioned it to me before the panel. But there are a lot of other firms in the market for years. Simon & Kucher is a German firm operating worldwide. Pros is another one doing airline pricing. So I think this is something that we should consider, and therefore I would favor very much a sector inquiry into the repricing industry.
Thank you. Marta, any thoughts from your side?
Well, just to be a dissident, I'm not sure I favor a sector inquiry in the area, mainly because my clients are going to have to respond to huge questionnaires, and I'm aware of that. But in the principle, that would be very, very interesting. But yeah, I think what I have discovered today is that there is a really cool research going on, and that's really very interesting, and I was not aware of that. So I think that's a space that we as professionals and the legal services in the companies, we have to watch. And I can imagine a day in which there would be a validation by someone like you internally in a company before taking any kind of business decision. And like today, we have validations by economists for rebate systems or any other kind of measures. So I think that would be probably the evolution in the future to try to assess what we are doing before we take the decisions. And just to add on the market transparency, it's true that RPM is one element, but I was thinking also generally about transparency on prices. It's true that, well, as you know, when you have having a transparent market is not a problem, but on a transparent market, the slightest bit of information you add to that can be a problem. So of course, if you have the transparency of the market raised by the algorithms, that also puts a lot of pressures in terms of compliance and training of your teams.
So thank you very much. Thanks for all these inspiring insights. I take from our discussion that there are a couple of open questions yet. For example, whether we can expect that at some point in time we might be faced with self-learning pricing algorithms that learn to collude in a real-world setting. The liability question seems also not being answered yet in the case practice. And especially Ulrich argued that authorities should indeed continue expanding their expertise on algorithms further. So I think we got some very nice insights, and please join me in thanking our panelists for this nice discussion. Thank you. I think we will have a coffee break of 15 minutes. Okay, if you have time, of course. Yeah. Happy to take any questions from the audience if there are any.
Yes, thank you. Merci. Yes, thank you. Jean-Mathieu Cotte, I'm avocat. I have a question for Professor Schwab. I think it's for you, but I understand things are complex, and and I was just thinking about what you were saying. Basically, that in a complex world where companies are selling, multi-products at different price, multi-pricing, and my take of what you said is that it would be even more difficult to have machine or algorithms coordinating between themselves. Saying that, I think that was my take of what you said. But if you use or you follow this path, this idea, should we take that even human beings in a world where you have multi-products, multi-pricing would be a way? I mean, the concept of collusion should be remote for human beings. Well, I'm maybe not very clear. My belief is that, of course, there will not necessarily be a collusion, of course, and that this is a complex world. But I think it's even more complex for human beings to collude than machine in this sort of environment. Or maybe, if I rephrase this, what you say that which would make difficult collusion between algorithms would be even more true for companies without algorithms, or what do you think about this idea? Your presentation was very interesting. I mean, I just tried to...
yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think the problem in multi-product firms to coordinate on prices is more difficult. Let me illustrate that with a very simple example. Imagine a firm selling two complementary products. So this firm has a strong incentive to keep the price of both products low because the increasing demand for one product stimulates the demand for the other. And imagine another firm selling just one of these two complementary products. That firm will definitely choose a different price because these relationships are not taken into account because it sells just one product. And therefore, the prices of the two firms will be different. And we don't know what algorithms will do in such a case. So that would be something that should be done in a simulation, that we would have several products and we could look at what is going to happen in these simulations. We could compare this then with what do firms currently do with respect to their pricing in a multi-product setting. There are a lot of firms advising retailers how to set their prices. And we could compare what is going on with these consulting firms, with the prices they advise, and what is the outcome when we have these algorithms. So my point is that we should extend our simulation models to cover also more realistic scenarios, including multi-product, multi-price firms.
So thank you. Maybe one more short question from you.
Thank you very much. From all the interesting things that we've heard today, it seems to me that we're more talking, and for example, taking the experiment of Professor Calvano, we're more talking about collective dominance than really express collusion. And your experiment is really a duopoly with transparency on the market, and we know that it can lead to tacit collusion. That's the theory behind collective dominance. And that's true that, for example, algorithm can lead to an environment that is more likely to lead to that collective dominance, for example, through transparency on prices. But collective dominance per se is not illegal. Right now, the legal standard is that you need something more, either an abusive conduct or express collusion to make it a cartel, for example. So do you think the legal standard should be different with algorithm, or does that thing with collective dominance still work? What do you think? So it's perhaps both for you and for Marta.
Right. So again, I'm not a legal expert, but it's true that law and practice is currently rooted in conspiracy. Okay, so we need to there should be a conscious meeting of minds to raise prices, and we should agree on some scheme and so on and so forth. And then the question is, why is that? And the reason and the answer is because we always thought that tacit collusion was a chimera, so something illusory and hard to achieve. So basically, if there is collusion, there must be some proof somewhere, and so we should document that to convict. And then, of course, the question is that adequate in a world, maybe, in the near future, maybe not, in which machines might actually do the trick themselves? And the answer is, I guess, no, but I leave it to the expert.
Thanks. Yes, I agree with you, and I think this was a case of collective dominance, but I'm not sure this kind of experiment works only in a duopoly. Probably you can expand it to markets in which you have more operators. And I agree with you, and that was the meaning of my final remark. We do not have to change the law to deal with these things, because we already have standards that work very well and that have been already quite stretched by the case law in the last years. And particularly tacit collusion has a very strict standard to it. So unless that standard is met, no, I don't think collusion between among algorithms could be an infringement. Then again, and that was also the sense of my remark of the rogue employee, maybe in some cases it can amount to an infringement, and then one has to ask who is liable for that. And that question for me is going to be quite difficult to answer.
I think that's a nice final remark. Thanks again, and we can continue our discussion in the coffee break.